Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to TKT Visionaries. Hello and welcome to TKT Visionaries. I must admit I'm really excited about today's guest. I have been learning a lot about NDI. I have spent a lot of time in the SMPTE 2110 world, and I'm just fascinated by this. And I've got two, the founder and leading experts in NDI. And first we have Andrew Cross, who is the former CTO and CEO of NewTek, and of course the inventor of NDI. And he also holds a PhD in computer vision and image processing from the University of York. And we also have Dan Miall, who is the founder and CEO of BirdDog, an industry leader in the NDI-based solutions for the broadcasters and live event industries. So welcome both of you, and thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us, Philip.
Yep, thanks. So let's start with the main culprit here, Andrew. Tell us a little bit about the history. How did NDI come about, and what is NDI for those who may not be as familiar with it?
Oh my goodness! So I could talk for an hour about that.
So give us the 10-minute synopsis. No, I'm just.
Oh dear, that's going to be very difficult.
Yeah.
Look, so what we saw happening was that increasingly computers have become the center of production. Software on computers are how all video production is now done. And what we saw was that the problem of transporting video between those computers was an unsolved problem, and we didn't see it getting solved. And so our goal with NDI was to democratize video, make it so that anyone, anywhere could use video. Our goal wasn't that NDI could be used in a broadcast facility. Our goal was that in every office building, anywhere in the world, in any room where there is a Ethernet jack, that became wired for video. And that is, what drove NDI. And we had, at NewTek, we developed the technology that basically enabled NDI long before, and we kept it proprietary. We used it to the benefit of our products. And I was out walking one day, actually, and I suddenly thought, this is something that we should make available to everybody. And I actually went in the next day and I called a meeting with a whole bunch of the key people at the company and said, we're going to take this thing that we made that is part of what makes our products good, and we're going to give it to the world. And everybody kind of looked at me in dazed and shocked, but that is what led to the creation of NDI. And the mission of NDI was quite simply always to enable video, anybody who wants to use video to be able to do so. And I guess we want to see it.
And for those who are uninitiated or uninformed, what exactly is NDI? What's sort of that 30,000-foot level, so people understand? We understand uncompressed video in the 2110 world, or SDI, but what is NDI?
The best analogy I can give is to say, if you're taking two devices, like I have a computer monitor in front of me and it's connected to my computer. They're connected via an HDMI cable. My TV is connected to my Fire TV stick via an HDMI cable. NDI is the Ethernet version of that. And the goal of NDI is to be able to take any devices, you just plug them into your network, and now they're interconnected and they can transport video between each other. And hopefully, if NDI works well on a good day, you don't even need to think about how that happens. You don't need to think about IP addresses. You don't need to think about, gateways. The devices just see each other. And so the goal, the mission was to replace HDMI cables by just Ethernet cables, which is the one thing that every building, in North America is wired for.
Yeah. And Dan, how did BirdDog come about, and specifically, what you guys are doing with NDI? What sort of has driven your company's formation and what you're doing today?
Yeah, sure. So I think it was probably around about that same time that Andrew was going for that walk and coming up with the idea of opening up what has become NDI. I actually had a company previous to BirdDog with another funny name called Blonde Robot. They're still a very successful company, but I've moved on to BirdDog. But we were representing NewTek at the time. So I actually remember a meeting I had with Andrew well before NDI, where I was asking him, why software? Why is TriCaster on software? Why can't we make a hardware version of a TriCaster? And exactly what he just said then is true, is that software is the future. That's where things are going. And it's true for what TriCaster was and still is, but it's also true, which might sound a little controversial, for every other piece of broadcast equipment as well. And so really the extension of that was, as we got talking more and more about the benefits of how software production could go, it became very clear that what was already in that technology with NewTek that became NDI was really something that was exciting and going to change the face of how TV production and really video production could be done in general with live content. So from my point of view, as soon as I learned about NDI, it sort of became this idea that, well, we need to have a device. It needs to be off the computer and onto hardware, onto cameras, into the real world, because that's where that interface actually happens. Mm-hmm. So the extension of going from a computer network connection is, what are you plugging that connection into on your device that's capturing those pictures, or on your device that's playing back that video, and that's where BirdDogs come in, and that's really where we began. Okay,
and where do you see? We were chatting offline before we began a little bit about, does it replace SMPTE 2110? Is it just a side part of how are we, or how are you and BirdDog looking at NDI in the, as we jokingly said, the professional video market, whatever that may actually mean? So where do you see NDI fitting into this large production arena?
Actually in a lot of places, but I think if we go just one layer down, you were talking about where does it sit between SMPTE 2110 versus NDI. I actually slightly disagree with Andrew in one point here, which is that NDI replaces that HDMI cable. Honestly, that's where I see SMPTE 2110 sits, is you're replacing one cable with another one. Where NDI really becomes special and really becomes scalable and allows a whole bunch of new productions and new things to be done is it is software defined in the true sense. You can use any compute device you have. So I've got my iPhone with NDI running on it to control my camera, for example. When you're working with 2110, the edge of that network is effectively your capture card, or your input into your vision switcher or whatever device you're using, where it then needs to be flipped out into uncompressed or flipped out into something. Where with NDI, it's native on your computer, it's native on your mobile devices, it's native on your network. So it sort of bleeds a lot further into that software space than what a SMPTE solution would do. And with that then becomes a real economy of scale. You've then got the access to that full compute power. So software then becomes a whole lot more accessible to make video. There's a whole bunch of applications out there now that can assist you in doing that video production, which in some cases may seem less broadcasty, but I can tell you a lot of broadcasters are using those to get the masses of content they're demanded on producing these days.
Yeah, Andrew, with when you developed NDI, if I'm not mistaken, it was a 2015-ish time frame, around there, earlier than that. I forget.
I don't know. I don't know myself. Good question.
Yeah. So when obviously when a SMPTE's big issues initially was just going to IP in general was just the amount of bandwidth that was required. 10 gig switches weren't the norm. Although I tell people now, it's the norm when you can go and order them online from the local big box store. But do you see the increase in processor performance and even GPU and CPU and network really enabling NDI to go to that next level?
Great question. And I think that, in all honesty, CPUs and GPUs have not been the bandwidth limitation for 10 years, or certainly for 5 years. They can process. They're spending most of their time doing nothing, and most of really you have to think computer devices today actually have these incredibly fast pieces of processing, and they're interconnected by very slow connections. So the bus from the CPU to the GPU is just like a straw compared to the bandwidth available on each. So actually the processing speed has not been a challenge for a long time.
Okay.
But if you go back to NDI, what we always saw was that the goal was to enable anything on a network to be able to talk video and to make it easy for the guys making software to do so. Now, 2110, even today, is not easy to put into pure software. You know, a interface card is still needed. And the goal of NDI, the dream of NDI, was that we were going to allow anything on any device to be able to very easily talk video. And that is what ultimately, you know, drove us to almost all the design decisions that became part of NDI. And NDI was absolutely never designed to solve the problems of broadcasters. And we saw and still see 2110 in many ways as doing that very, very well. NDI was solving a different problem for different people. And to the extent that I think broadcasters find NDI useful, which I am very happy about, this is as much a statement of how broadcast is changing as, you know, NDI. But I never saw these as the same thing, and it was never I think 2110 is a remarkable standard and works really well in the problem domain that it was designed for.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, speaking of that, how broadcasters have changed, and Dan, over the last 3 years, we went through the lockdowns, and, you know, and everything went to remote. Did you see an adoption or a greater adoption, or just I mean, maybe for lack of a better term, just a increase or acceleration of that transformation, as Andrew mentioned, that broadcasting has changed? And have you seen that, and what's been the impact with NDI in your products?
Yeah, absolutely. I think with what happened with all of the lockdowns, I do remember actually it was over in the US. I was having a conversation with one of the larger broadcasters there. It was back just before the lockdowns hit, and their rollout plan for going IP was between 4 and 5 years. I remember having that conversation, thinking, well, yeah, it's a long burn. We're going to have to keep talking with these guys and see what we can do in terms of helping them out to work with that transition. And it was only 3 months later they were on the phone saying, we need to run our broadcast out of a garage. How do we do this? So, yeah, I think in a lot of ways there has been a step change in the way broadcasters have approached things over the last couple of years, some out of necessity, but then that's kind of got the genie out of the bottle in terms of, well, maybe we don't need to do everything the way we've done it before. And I really think that's collided with, as Andrew mentioned as well, the demands that are on broadcasters these days. They're, the people are wanting to view what they want to view, as far as content. It's less of a broadcast. It's now having a lot of special interest channels in a lot of ways for a lot of these broadcasters. And so to scale that up, the way that's moved on is, broadcasters have to rethink how they're done. So I think, in some ways that lockdown, the pandemic, and making that change on the production side of things has allowed them to look at how their business model works. And that's coincided with the way people want to view content as well.
Well, I think it's one thing that I noticed over the last year and a half or so. I've been involved in a lot of sort of organizations wanting to move things, quote unquote, to the cloud. We'll just use it as a generic term, whether it's private or public. And one of the things I found interesting, and this actually goes to Andrew's point of NDI being software based, and that's its goal, is that I've seen more and more of the large vendors, the Vizes, the Everts, the Grasses, as people want to do the production in the cloud, their production software is really adopting NDI. And do you think that adoption is really, and this is, I guess, to Andrew, is that sort of, is that what your vision is? Your vision coming to life now as NDI has gone into version 5 and beyond, that we're seeing the adoption with that very software-centric model that people are rolling out in these large organizations?
I think the answer to your question, the short answer is, of course, yes. But I think that this was just straight economics. I mean, I think that, processors were getting faster and faster, driven by the economics of scale of computing. And it was inevitable that at some point, it would be more affordable to build video processing on general purpose processors than it would be to build dedicated processors. And I think that this move to the cloud, everything is a reflection of the basic economics of processing. And NDI was simply solving the problem of how do you connect all these pieces. And it was a problem that absolutely needed to be solved. Somebody was going to solve it, and I saw the opportunity for it to be us. Mm-hmm. And I think that move, what's happening in the cloud, everything is a sub problem of this move to software and the use of general purpose processing. And they are not in themselves the underlying trend. The underlying trend is software. It's the affordability of processing and the fact that we've now got network connections that interconnect everything, so it doesn't matter where it is done. Everything else is a side effect of those three things.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I know, and I'll use the term loosely, the professional broadcasters. One thing that was always driving our customers was latency. Everything's about latency and timing. And if I'm not mistaken, NDI really didn't necessarily have a support for timing or timing protocol. I think 5.1 or 5.0 changed that. I see that as a good thing. Do you see much, and this is for Dan, do you see much pushback? I know that NDI in general, the latency is fairly small, and the fact that we're going to the cloud anyhow and you're doing H.264 compression and SRT throws a lot of latency in there. So maybe people are becoming a little less stringent on it. But did you get pushback initially with the product set around, it's latency, I'm going to have a frame or two delay, which most things have a frame or two delay, or were people accepting of that in the fact that the ease of use of the NDI solutions?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question as well. I think in some cases, latency versus sync sometimes thrown into the one bucket, and they're very different things. So certainly some people have an issue with latency. I mean, a great example, which is not particularly broadcasty, although it can be used in sports environments, is IMAG. So when you have a large screen behind someone, every frame stacks up on top of the next one. So latency is really important. So keeping that as low as possible is something that's really important. And there is some cool tricks that you can do to make NDI as fast as possible. And we've actually got some great examples where actually, when you're looking at in-venue, we can make NDI faster than SDI. If you need to repeat that SDI to go over a long period of a long distance, you're going to introduce latency there, but the network can just be one hop. So it can kind of go one way or the other. But the bigger problem really is sync, and that's something sync with audio and video, but sync across multiple cameras. And that can still be solved, absolutely, in software and in NDI. We've actually done quite a lot of work in that cloud space. One thing I suppose for me is I'm not really about making little black boxes that widget from SDI to NDI. It's really about building out a solution for a production or for a conference or whatever it might be. And so that part of the software stack that we build has got a lot of sophisticated work that's gone in there to maintain that sync. And as you say, when you're going over anything that's not in venue, whether it's broadcast, whether it's to OTT or whether it's to YouTube, it doesn't really matter necessarily about that latency. It's about making sure all of those videos are in sync. And that's something we spend a lot of time on. That's not really an underlying NDI problem that they had. It's really a software solution that was waiting to be found. And that's what we've built in. For example, we can send as many streams of video as you like down a single pipe and retain sync across all of those. And that gets you into the cloud where you can use whatever production system you like. So, yeah, it was a problem for sure. But every problem has a creative solution, right?
Yeah, well, that's one of the things that I really sort of noticed as I was doing more and more investigation and talking to the various vendors around their NDI solution was that it really does seem to sort of simplify the implementation. One of the big ones that I found, having done a lot of key fill, is that key fill is a single stream, single cable, as opposed to having to have key and fill. So obviously that makes things easier. And the fact that you can go power over Ethernet really sort of simplifies that. Are you seeing sort of, maybe I should flip the question around. What are you seeing as the big drivers for your customers to adopt NDI? What are those things? The technology, obviously cost is part of it, but are there technological aspects of it like that single key fill, PoE, those kind of things that's really driving the adoption?
Yeah, I think the simplification absolutely makes a big play into where NDI has been successful. In some ways, I think actually when we came out with our first product, it was really unique that it was PoE powered. So in some ways, that's actually relatively new. And what really that unlocked is one cable for everything. It's a bit like if you imagine in a broadcast facility, you've got a SMPTE fiber cable. That's really expensive, and you need a lot of supporting gear around that. But your Ethernet cable almost becomes that same thing. You can carry your audio, your video, your control, tally, everything can be down that one single cable. And that really dramatically simplifies from a broadcast setup point of view. They can be much more nimble, but it also becomes a lot more approachable, right? So if you're wanting to get into content production and expanding beyond that sort of tippy top of the triangle, but still wanting to make a production that looks and feels, smells like broadcast, having that simplification means you can concentrate more on the creative side of things rather than stressing out about how I'm going to actually get these things to work together. So NDI, I think in a lot of ways that approachability has been the key to the success. The fact that Andrew had the foresight to put in all of the discovery and metadata control all wrapped up in a bow, ready for people to use in whatever software or whatever solution they wanted. It means, as he said, it kind of just works. And it's a bit of magic, especially in those early days. It was really fun watching people experience how NDI just turned on and worked. It was like, well, where's the trick? How did this happen? And it just happens because it's been designed that way. And I think it's really been the catalyst to how that's expanded, because broadcasters can have maybe slightly less skilled people on some of those productions, and people that are wanting to get into production can elevate what they're doing because they're not bogged down with that technology from either a cost point of view or a complexity point of view.
So, Andrew, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think Dan said a couple of really, really important things there. And I think that I think, first of all, I think NDI, to me, the key thing is accessibility and ease of use. I think that, in my home, I could walk out of the room I'm in and I could attach a PTZ camera to our local network, and I could attach a TriCaster to that network, and I'm going to be able to make them work. That is something that anybody on this, watching this, any one of us could do. Even though I think I know a decent amount about computers, I couldn't do that with 2110. And if I was in a TV station, I'd absolutely be able to use 2110, and it would be there'd be a lot of benefits of it. But for everybody else, this ease of use is absolutely key. And then I think that this ease of use then allows you to start thinking and realizing that it's actually about the content that you're creating. And I think this is, what Dan said, that is just completely right. And I think that, we actually brought up COVID before. I think one of the huge shifts to the entire industry was in COVID, we had to give up thinking about technology and using technology to drive the way we made video, and instead we started focusing on what the content was. And I still have this really great recollection. It was right at the beginning of COVID, and I was actually I had somebody who is at a 3-letter TV station in the US that I can't name call me up, and they'd been struggling at using NDI, and they'd asked about timing, and they'd asked about how many bits it was, about discovery, all these complicated things. And he called me up, and I was like, oh no, I've got to take this and try debugging it. And he then said something to me that stuck with me. He said, okay, so we're moving all of our producers home, and we're going to be using NDI. And I said, well, so did you get all those problems solved? And he said, no, Andrew, you don't get it. He said, it's no longer about how we get those problem solved. It's how do we get people out of the building? And this forced them, they needed to do it. And suddenly, every one of these TV shows went from thinking about, they realized that you can run a show. You can run a show like we are here, where you can do it over Zoom. And, it becomes about the great content. And it's no longer about how can we fly somebody into the studio and have them in the studio. Instead, it's who can we call that would be the best person to talk to on this subject. And so this ease of use, and it's not just NDI, it was a huge transformation in the entire industry, but allowed our industry to start thinking about the content and the quality of that content, which is great for the content producers, is great for the viewers. And I think NDI and technologies like NDI were the enablers of this, and this is a huge transformation that has really changed the whole way TV is made, that in a way that's better for everybody. And I think, Dan said that maybe quicker than I did, but I think that this is a trend that we need to recognize. And when we look at the technologies we need, they're going to be the ones that tend to allow us to continue down this path.
I think I may know the 3-letter call station that you're talking about. I've been involved with them as well, and I was pretty impressed with the size NDI implementation, what they were doing with it. So, Andrew, I don't know if you're still involved with the standards and the NDI standards, but as you look at where they're going and what they're doing, are you or maybe happy is not the right word. Are you in agreement with the direction it's going and continue, or do you sort of, as that founder, still kind of want to get in there and say, we need to do a little more of this, or where do you think the NDI standard is going?
Let me answer it this way.
Okay.
My oldest daughter just left home for university. Super hard for me, being very emotional, very, very difficult. NDI is the same. I moved on from NDI, and it is absolutely wonderful that it is different people. It got to 21 and can drink on its own, and I need to trust it to drive safely. And that is a really great thing. That's something that makes it stronger, and we have a great team that I completely trust. It's not fair for me to judge them any more than I would ever judge my daughter. My daughter is amazing. NDI is amazing. It was time for it to leave home, and that is a great thing. That is great for NDI, and I have the utmost trust, and they has a great team with really smart people. They're going to do amazing things.
Perfect. Dan, one of the questions I have is, typically, and you're doing a REMI broadcast or something like that, the traditional model is you're going to do H.264, and you're going to do an SRT or RIST or some other transport. NDI sort of takes the need to do all that away, doesn't it? How does NDI work over, say, a public internet? If I wanted to, just something very simple, my father lives, 25 miles away. If I wanted to have a receiver on his side and a camera on my side and be able to just have a conference call with him using NDI, how does it work over public internet like that?
Yeah, so I think there's like with everything, there's a couple of different answers to that. The answer is NDI. The fact that it's on a network already means it's native, and you could argue the same thing to a point with the SMPTE 2110, but it's designed to work on a broader set of networks. Going over public internet does set another level of complexity from a routing point of view and from a bandwidth and quality of service kind of thing. But certainly NDI, there's a couple of ways you can do it. Now, built into the NDI tool is a bridge application where you can take any NDI source and take that somewhere else. We've extended that even further. So for a production type environment, if you use our BirdDog cloud system, which is built on top of that as well, all those different acronyms you were talking about, whether it's SRT or RIST or any other formats, they're all great and you can use those. But they're transports. They're getting video from one place to another. And that's not making television. That's getting video from one place to another. Right. And so what you can do with NDI, and again, with the way this kind of stack builds up on the software side of things, is have that bi-directional connectivity. So it's a bit like I was talking about before, where you have one cable to go into a device that gives you power and audio, video, and tally. With NDI and going over the internet and having this software stack available, it's one connection gives you audio and video control and tally and all of the other things, which you don't get out of just getting a direct connection over a transport. So again, I think this NDI, the way that it's sort of aware of all of the components that make up the use of audio and video, and being able to encapsulate those in a way that allows for full control, does allow you to, if you were connecting to your, to someone at the other end in their living room, you could control the camera on the other side. So actually, I want to have a look over there at the dog that's playing in the garden or whatever that might be. And it's the same thing with a TV production. You can run that truly remote rather than having just the video coming in from a remote source.
Do you, Andrew, do you see NDI? So I always use the sort of that Apple model, where Apple initially they put stuff in schools so that people get used to them, and then when they graduate and become professionals and work in corporate, they bring that idea of, well, I used Apple products, I'm going to use them in the professional market. NDI made television broadcast very accessible. It was very easy to use, and so you saw it in the NewTek. I think was great, and I learned all about the NewTek stuff from Leo Laporte and listening to, because it was one of my favorite shows, listening to him and talking about the NewTek TriCaster and the NDI and learning it from there. And it made it very accessible to somebody who doesn't have the deep pockets but has the capability, the vision, as you say, to build a television program. Do you see that sort of as that I don't want to call it a Trojan horse, but there's so many people using it as an introduction to television broadcast because it's accessible that the adoption is going to sort of accelerate over time?
Yeah, so I clearly, I don't think there was ever a strategy. If we go and get the beginners, they'll become professionals one day. That takes 15, 20 years. I think that far more important is, look, surely if you make video easier to use, if you make it so that that people are focusing on making great shows, that's what people want. If you really sit down and talk to a customer, so you can go to the biggest TV station or the smallest sports league and say, what's your mission? They're going to say it's to make great entertainment for our viewers. And some of them might say, it's got to be HDR or 10-bit, or it's got to have 1 frame latency or something. But you go, okay, so is that your mission? That at the end of the day, they're going to say, no, it's making great content.
Right.
And if you make that easier, you're going to make it better for everybody. And I really do think that that's what drove us. And if anything else is a side effect of trying to focus on that. And in hindsight, we succeed on some things, we failed on others, but I think that was certainly what drove us.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on that. I think sometimes my customers in the past have been too tied into what is the latency. The example I always use, I had one customer with a multi-viewer that it had to be less than 1.5 frames of latency on the multi-viewer, and I kept telling them, you can't press the button that fast. You're not going to see the 1.5 frames. So I think, and it's sort of interesting as we talk about timing and sync. Well, obviously sync is very important, but timing is that as we've gotten, I'll call it advanced technologies, the NDIs, the 2110s, as we move to that, the timing has gotten looser. Because if you think about in the analog days, the timing, I think, was in microseconds in order to get colors to align. And now, we're in milliseconds, and frames, and going to multi-frames. Is timing, especially in this sort of that REMI world that I see a lot of, and this question for Dan, are you seeing people less worried about that because everything's sort of, as long as it's in sync, we're good?
Look, to an extent, as long as it's in sync, we're all good. But like I say, for REMI, you do need to be able to have a level of latency to have a natural conversation. So there's a limit to how much that can be. And I think you're right. In a lot of ways, timing has loosened up quite a lot. If you look at it, we're talking milliseconds. A frame is 16 milliseconds, which in compute is an eternity in a lot of ways. But for people, that's still extremely fast. There's no way you can react in that sort of time frame. So I think timing is something that's really important, and there's kind of a confluence of a couple of things going on there. Which one of those is NDI at version 1, and the way the software worked and the hardware and things that were available at the time had a pretty low amount of latency. It wasn't anywhere near 1 frame, but it was pretty close. It was a couple of frames. But as things have moved on, that's getting tighter and tighter. So networks are getting better managed and things like that. And so you can build up these networks with NDI that are actually extremely low latency and can rival what you can do with things like SDI or 2110.
What is
specifically?
It's just go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, but specifically for REMI productions, it's you need to keep that within sort of sub-second each way, 2-second round trip over the public internet if you're going to have a conversation that makes any sense. Otherwise, you need a really talented person at the other end to be able to carry that forward.
Yeah, I remember I worked for a bit of time at the Weather Channel, and it was, if you were more than 5 frames, we couldn't have that conversation naturally. And of course, the response was always, well, we do things over satellite, which is even longer than that. I goes, yeah, but people are used to that. So where are we on that latency in the NDI world, and where do we see it going?
Yeah, I think there's been some really good leaps and bounds. Sorry, Andrew, you might want to answer this. Closer to it.
Oh my God, this is a complicated question, and I think so. First of all, let me just answer the question with a number. I think that technically, NDI is not limited in terms of latency by anything other than the speed of the computers delivering it. It's never the speed of the network. The speed of the networks are crazy fast.
Right.
And if you have, let's say, a pre-compressed video signal, NDI could send it at probably 2 milliseconds latency between 2 computers, and so it could be very, very low. Lower, as Dan said, it could be lower than video. So the question is then, okay, so you need to compress it. So that takes some time. There's a bunch of things, but I think that the my reaction to timing and latency is, maybe naive, but I would argue that it's not. I think that the real question is, why do we need to worry about those things? In the audio world, we've been doing audio mixing for decades, for 50 years, and you hook up a microphone and it works, and nobody in the audio world ever thought about timing. Just wasn't a thing. And so I just, and I know that we are so close to video that we understand that there's clocking issues and that there's lots of reasons, but I think my first reaction has got to be, our responsibility as the technology creators for this industry should be not to look about how low can we make this, but instead to ask, why on earth is this needed in the first place? Mm-hmm. And success to me is finding a way for people not to think about timing. And I know that there's going to be a few cases where, sure, you need to think about it. But I think that with NDI, the mission was, and it is, and should be, I don't want hardly anybody to even have to think about timing, because that is failure when they have. And there are a few cases where you do, and I think that you and Dan have named them. When you're doing a production, the latency needs to be low enough that the video signal is interactive, that you and I can talk properly. Yep. But there's only a few cases beyond that where it's truly needed. And if your goal is to solve it for the 99%, your goal should be to work out how on earth to not even think about it. And the last 1% might really need it. And maybe 2110 is going to solve it better for those guys, and that is just fine. Your 99% are what matters.
That 1%, I think, is sports betting. I just remember in any projects where I was involved in the sports side of the house, if there was any type of betting involved, that latency had to be really, really low. So, again, it's an edge case for sure.
Stock market and sports betting.
Yeah, exactly. Which, in general, they're about the same thing. I think.
No comment. No comment. You are completely right, though.
Yeah. Dan, are you seeing? So you guys make obviously great hardware and cameras. Are you seeing? I mean, there are very few cameras coming out yet that have a 2110 spigot built in. They're just starting. Are you starting to see, because it's a software-oriented product, NDI being incorporated into cameras as a sort of a standard, so that you have this big, I'm a big fan of a toolkit. I want as many Lego blocks as possible to build what I need to build. Are we seeing the adoption across those various vendors now, removing that HDMI and we're going to put an NDI spigot instead?
Yeah, look, I think the answer is absolutely yes, and I think that's a great thing. Obviously, we make cameras. We want people to buy our cameras, but it's up to us to make the solution that people want to buy. But to have more and more of these people, more and more of these vendors producing products with NDI brings up that whole accessibility. We know people don't want to buy a solution from one vendor. That's a risky thing to do. You're putting all your eggs in one basket. So. From my point of view, absolutely all of the big guys you can name, they've got NDI in their cameras in one way or another. There's a whole series of other cameras that are coming out which are built for prices to fit into areas where people just need to get video of any sort. And so it's great to see that NDI is kind of bleeding down into those areas as well. So I think, from my point of view, probably the biggest thing we haven't seen yet, and I don't think anyone's been quite brave enough to do, is to take off those HDMI connectors and take off those SDI connectors, because the reality is we're moving to that world, whether it's 2110 or whether that's NDI, those connectors are superfluous. They're just adding places to duplicate it, really. So from that point of view, that's the bit that we haven't seen yet, is that next step in, we don't need those other connectors. So I think over the next couple of years, you might see some people starting to... Yeah,
well, Apple, remove the earphone jack or the headphone jack. And they got a lot of guff for it, right? But it's exactly. Well, I'm impressed with the fact that it's very software oriented. So that really, it's sort of where I see in the routing infrastructure with 2110, that in the past you had to have giant iron, and whoever made the giant iron made the software that controls it. And now that we've gone to utilizing generalized switches or higher end switches, I'm seeing a lot more vendors get into that broadcast controller market and building these things. Are you seeing that sort of that same thing with NDI as it's propagated out throughout that industry, throughout our industry, that we're seeing more and more people adopt it? And I always sort of say, well, when Adobe adds it into their Premiere as an ingest, we know that it's made mainstream. But are we seeing that happen more and more?
Premiere supports NDI.
Yep.
So
exactly.
I have to. So does Media Composer, and so does Final Cut Pro. I think yes. I mean, I think there's broader and broader adoption. I think that the really interesting thing is where you start to see it get used in things that were never where it was expected. Mm-hmm. And those are the real sign of adoption is, when we saw a casino getting built that actually was routing video around, with video, when we, with NDI, or when we saw a downtown signage in a media district with all the big LED boards on the side of buildings using NDI, which we had no idea about. Those are the things that tell me, you've done something where it's caught fire on its own and it's now, burning, it's self-sustaining. And it's all of those really creative uses that are, exciting. And I think, I've seen, Dan has already moved out into things like the medical world, which was something that was never a thought. Mm-hmm. When we created NDI, and yet you've got people building companies around it. That is exciting, and I think those are how you measure adoption. It's actually, when you lost control of it. We've lost control of it.
That's actually interesting. I spent a bit of time in the hotel industry, and one of the things was digital signage and how that was operated. And originally it was centralized and coax to the screens, and then it was okay. We're going to do it as IP to the screen, but I had to have a box on the back. Have we seen any of the major? I mean, one thing we joke about is that people are like, oh, no one's going to put a 2110 cable on the back of a television. I said, well, no one puts an SDI box on the back or input on the back of a monitor either. We've always had those little boxes. Have we seen a television manufacturer or a monitor manufacturer that supports NDI natively? Are we going to see that?
I think the answer is yes, and I'm afraid I can't name the vendors off the top of my head. I know we were working with a few when I left, and I would expect that. But I think that this comes down to one of the core premises. Every TV today has an ARM CPU on it. It has a network connection. NDI needs those two things to be able to make it work. No hardware needed. And so, you are correct. Something like 2110 is hard to add to a TV, but that TV is already NDI ready, and it's just a software problem to get it onto it. And that I guess is what was always the mission, and what set NDI apart from what most other standards do.
Dan, are you guys, do you make I think if I understand your product, you have converters, so you can take in an SDI signal or take in a regular HDMI signal and turn it into NDI, which really then simplifies the whole process. Are there a lot of other manufacturers doing the same thing? I know you guys are one of the leaders, and I've gotten to see a lot of your products at NAB and IBC, and I'm looking forward to IBC in a few weeks to look at even more stuff and really look at it in more detail. Are the converters becoming more ubiquitous? Because again, it is, as you said, it's software related, so that's a very powerful thing.
Yeah, I think there's the answer is yes and no at the same time. There's a few vendors out there that do converters. So there's choice, which I think is a really good thing. So we've got our encoders, which can take anything from HDMI or SDI and put them onto your network and have all of the that low latency processing that we can do. Probably the on the other side of things, that distribution, when you were talking about in hotels or putting it into screens, the answer is actually yes on both of those, where we actually have worked with a couple of vendors. NEC's been really strong on that from a commercial display side of things, where they now have an NEC panel that's enabled with NDI that we worked in partnership with. So you can, for commercial displays, you can buy a screen and hang it on the wall, plug a network in, and you're done. No boxes, no anything else, which is pretty cool. An extension of that is actually on the converter side. I think distribution is far more important in how we simplify it. So, you can run a decoder. I'm looking at a screen that's running a decoder at the moment to make it easier to look at the camera. But we also have software, as Andrew said. There's Android apps that we build now, which are native NDI. So with your smart TV, you can just connect directly to that NDI source. We're not having to do tricks to convert it or do any other funky things. It's just it's another interaction point on the network that can see that NDI, and we're just using the processor that's already available to us. So the concept of a converter is probably more around the concept of a receiver, and that receiver can be hardware or software because it's NDI.
Do we see any of the major manufacturers, the Everts, the Vizes, and Imagines and Grasses, building sort of the NDI to 2110 or 2110 to NDI to sort of link those two technologies together? Are we seeing that happen?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think HAA have a great product that does that. I think that actually you could do that just with NDI out the box if you have the right capture card and just want to put an NDI out. I mean, there's a lot of Grass Valley support both in AMP, so it would be easy to transcode between them. Everts do the same in their product. So I think that NDI has become widespread enough that moving them between standards is actually really not that complex. I think NewTek have a product that is designed specifically to do NDI in and out of 2110 as well. So I think it's totally achievable, and the catch-all answer is always going to be this is software. Anybody, a kid in their basement could download our SDK and make this work. And I would. Maybe if for anything that's missing there, it's a great opportunity, and I would encourage the smart, bright people who see the next big thing in video to go out and do it, because that is what NDI, look, we wanted to make it available in software so people can bring the video in and out, and the vendors, the people making the cool new tools can just think about the cool new tools, not how do you transport video around. And if they do that, there's just really exciting, great things that can be done in video.
And I think one of the advantages most definitely is the fact that because it is a lightly compressed format, that 4K, I mean 4K in IP just in 2110 it doesn't quite fit in a 10 gig connection. So you got to go to a 25 gig at minimum where you can do a 4K signal on a 1 gig connection. So are we seeing maybe that as I don't want to necessarily call it a differentiator, because I agree with you, Andrew, in terms of you should always let your business drive your business, let technology enable it. But do we see that, Dan, people adopting this because it can do the 4K and they can do their broadcasts and not have to invest in 100 gig switches?
Absolutely. I think the infrastructure side of things is a big concern. Like if you wanted to, we've seen them all. You see the big, the sports trucks, the OB trucks, where there's a huge investment in that to do 4K production in the field. To do that with NDI is an order of magnitude more achievable, and so we're seeing people do that, and it's really interesting to see where 4K is kind of coming. There's really two camps on that. There's some people who just say 1080p is enough because it's going over the internet and people are going to watch it at 1080p. But then there's some really interesting cases where, as Andrew said, we wouldn't really see it being as important, where people are really adamant they want 4K, and it's just not achievable in any other way to have some sort of meaningful production done with the budget that they've got and the elevated kind of image quality that they want. So that really is something that's quite unique, as you say, from an infrastructure point of view. Running on a 10 gig network with 3G based SDI signals, you can get things around, and SMPTE is relatively achievable in that environment. But when you go up to that 4K, it really amps up pretty quickly in terms of the technicalities around that.
Does NDI, I'm assuming the answer is yes, but does NDI support HDR and the various flavors of HDR just encapsulated within the NDI signal?
It does, although I think that the next versions of NDI are going to support that far more natively than the current ones. I want to go back to this compression issue, because I actually think that this is something that our industry somehow they think about wrong. And I'm going to go outside of our industry and think about this. Imagine that there is a new way of building a car, and with this new car technology, you could achieve 10 times the gas mileage, with the downside that the top speed of the car is reduced by 10%, but 10 times the gas mileage. would car vendors adopt it? This is a no-brainer because you go from 40 miles per gallon for a great car to 400 miles a gallon, and it's totally game-changing. That is what compression does for video, and we often forget that. It gives you 10 to 1, which means instead of us worrying about the fact that at a particular resolution it looks maybe slightly less worse, we need to think about the fact that it lets us do things that were never possible before, and where you can do 4K on a network, you couldn't have done that before. And you can now get 8K working or 16K working, where before you could only barely get 1080p working. And so compression is the exact equivalent of increasing the gas mileage by 10x, which is game changing. And this is something that we should embrace and use instead of look at as a downside. And I think that, that once broadcast technology starts to look at it that way, they're going to see that it gives them huge benefits across all sorts of areas where it's not being used today.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think, and an individual, David Aspley, had mentioned that it's sort of like, not in a pejorative sense, but it's sort of like the MP3 to CD world, but everybody listens to compressed audio, and you're hard pressed to really tell the difference. But now, instead of having a spinning disc, I've got a file that I can have on my phone, or hundreds of files on my phone, and the quality, I don't want to say the quality is good enough. It's very good. Most people can't tell the difference. And I think that maybe NDI is going to enable that, to your point, Andrew, of okay, I'm going to increase that gas mileage and get to do a lot more for just a minimal decrease in, we'll say, quality, although I don't think most human beings can see the difference. And that value just starts to add up as people start to do productions.
Well, yeah, that's a great analogy, because, audio today is actually all about Spotify and Apple Music. It's not about us storing MP3 files on our phones anymore. At least I and my kids don't. The fact that there was a wholesale change for the whole way we consume audio, or certainly music, was created. It was compression that enabled it. If we'd stuck with CDs, which are slightly high quality, that complete change that is a dramatic improvement would not have been possible. And so we need to see that these technologies are disruptive and will change things, no matter whether we like them or not. And if we don't take advantage of that, others will. And so I think it's really important that we see that, and we see that there's huge upsides that come along with these things. And sure, there's a downside. MP3 is not quite as good as uncompressed, but MP3 changed the world and uncompressed didn't.
Right. Are we starting to see, obviously, virtual sets, virtual studios, those kind of things, the volumetric spaces are the next big thing. I remember, 2 years ago at NAB, if you didn't have a virtual set at your stand, then you were nobody. Everybody seemed to have one. Thank God this year it seemed to go away a little bit. But do we see NDI being injected or adopted in those worlds as well?
It clearly is widely used in those worlds. But let me make a bold statement. I don't think the virtual sets are the next big thing. I think it's going to be AI and generative AI and its impact on broadcast and enabling and changing the way we do broadcast. That's the next big thing.
Yeah, I would agree.
And I think we will look back and see that virtual sets were a cheap, difficult. Well, no, that's probably not true. A cheaper but less effective and usable way of achieving much the same thing.
Yeah, and Dan, are you guys seeing a lot of adoption in the virtual sets, and obviously AI is the next big thing, seeing the NDI sort of being injected and adopted in those realms?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you both said, there's certainly a push around AI, and also in terms of mixed and virtual reality. On that second point on mixed and virtual reality, the one thing I think is that really lends itself well within NDI is, I've mentioned it a couple of times, but this control protocol that's built into NDI means that every frame can have metadata associated with it, which dovetails really nicely into the volumetric space thing, where you can embed those, the X, Y, Z coordinates, iris values, and all the things that make that mixed reality able to be done and able to be achieved. So I think NDI actually is well suited for it, and there's a lot of people using it in that space, and we fully support that in various different products in different ways. In terms of where we're heading with AI, absolutely, I couldn't agree more with Andrew. I think for me, the the biggest thing about broadcast is that it's broadcast. We've still got that. We've got this network. We've been talking about how things can be from one place to another very easily. We've got a web of connections rather than a hub and spoke. But our production is still the hub of that. The switcher is still the hub of that. And I think broadcast, in a lot of ways, is primed for a big change there. And there's no way we can do that just by having more mixing desks for different people to use. That's got to have AI. It's got to have more embedded smarts in that. And I think there's going to be some big step changes with that, regardless of what we're using in terms of that transport, whether it's NDI or 2110. I think the big thing to watch is where productions are going and how that's being achieved, and what are those autopilots that we can build with AI that are going to help us achieve better productions.
Well, fantastic. Well, we're coming up on the top of the hour. This has been a wonderful conference. I have learned so much from this conversation. So I want to sort of maybe close this out with each of you sort of, Andrew, being the father of NDI, where do you see it going? Where do you hope to see it go over the next 18, 36, 48 months? What is sort of your vision of where you want to see it, adoption and usage and those kind of things?
I feel tempted to say that look, what we want is video. We want to enable all sorts of new ways of doing video. And I think to achieve that, you need to stop thinking about how it's connected and start thinking about the tools that are used to create it. So in some ways, I want NDI to become unnoticed, as ironic as that is, because I think, even when we think about AI, I talked about AI. AI is software. You need a way to connect video into that software to be able to run AI on. And I want that to become so easy that people don't think about how it's done, so that we can build the great new tools. And I'm very hopeful that will happen. I think NDI is currently what I would bet on as what will achieve that, because I don't think there's anything that comes close to it yet at solving those problems. I watch and truly believe that is where it's headed, which is the exact right way. And so I feel really very confident about this. And I think that we're going to see new tools, new technologies, new ways of doing TV that 5 years from now, we will look back on and think, wow, what we were doing 5 years ago seemed weird and old. NDI or the technologies like it are going to be that achieve that, and I want it to be NDI. But I feel complete confidence that is what the world will look like 5 years from now.
Perfect. And Dan, where do you see it going, and where's BirdDog going, and what are you guys looking at? What's sort of driving what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I think just sticking to the broadcast production side of things to begin with, I think we mentioned Apple earlier, and the way they've moved along on the iOS environment from that material design that was trying to make things look like wood panels, and now we've moved on to something completely new. And I think that's the same thing with production. The exciting stuff I see is how we're going to do things differently, not how we're replacing a piece of gear in a production with a piece of software that does the same thing, but how do we actually make, and it's a lot of what Andrew was saying as well, how do we make new ways of doing things that actually produce a meaningfully different outcome in terms of that production. So I think, from that side of things, AI, as I mentioned in the last little piece, in terms of how broadcast is going to be produced, is going to have a massive play within that. And NDI is primed really well to enable that, because you need to get the ins and outs into those brains. The other part, from a BirdDog point of view, is getting NDI into more spaces, and it's probably a little bit off piece for the purpose of this conversation. As Andrew mentioned just briefly, we've actually made some really pretty significant inroads into the medical industry, where you don't sort of think about that as being a video-focused area, but we can make some really big differences there in terms of having access to multiple different video sources that can be accessed remotely, like we were talking about with Remy, but giving that to a neurosurgeon or someone like that is really game-changing, and finding other industries like that. So I think, for us as a company, where we're not looking to spread, we're not looking to make 500 different products that all specifically work for individual things. What we're looking at is applications of how the technology we've got can actually go a whole lot further, and actually, when you look at what broadcast does, that applies to medical, it applies to AV industries, it applies to education, and where that's going to head out, and how we manage the ever-growing amounts of sources to have the right content at the right time for the right people. So I think that's really the exciting thing with that. Right now, we're still in that process of moving along. We've replaced the cables. We've started to get software involved, but we're still, largely doing those productions in the same way. So taking that to the next level. And I do look forward, Andrew, in the same thing, and looking back in 5 years' time going, wow, that was pretty old school what we were doing there. So.
All right, wonderful. Well, we have a couple of people who have joined us from the audience who have some questions. If you guys are interested or happy to take some questions from people, we'd love to do that. So I think we have, is it Mitchell, I believe is the individual? You want to add him in and so he can ask a question?
I'm sorry, did you say Mitchell?
Mitchell, yeah. I don't know if you had
yeah. So, I do have a question. So I run into a lot of this recently because I've been doing a lot of 2110 and such. This is more for Dan, is there plans, or do you know plans from anybody in the future bringing back an NDI to 2110, 2110 to NDI converter?
Look, I think that's a pretty logical step. I'm just looking at the screen behind. I'm loving the fact that you got one of our user interfaces there.
Oh. Well, I mean,
in terms of, that's all good.
It's been an interesting process. Yes. Go ahead.
Okay. We've got, there's a number of things you can do with that. As Andrew mentioned, with there's capture cards that support 2110, and you convert those to NDI. In terms of a hardware converter like what we make, I think there's probably a tipping point that will happen where that makes a lot of sense. So rather than having so many SDI connectors on there, they'll have things like 2110 to be able to go in and out of these different formats. The whole nature of a converter is to do exactly that, right? So as those formats become more widespread, then it makes sense to have those connections. So
yeah, because
I don't have an announcement right now, but it's going to happen, right?
Oh, good. Because my other option is to build one, right? And I'm not really interested in doing that. So that would be awesome. All right, thank you very much.
That's where I started from, so I can tell you it's a hell of a road to build a product. But if you want to, that would be awesome.
No, I think my wife would shoot me. All right, thanks a lot, guys.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Mitchell.
So great. And Davey, did you have a question as well? Do you want to add Davey? Unmute Davey.
There we go. I was just listening across. It was just very interesting, but I've been doing this now for 5 years or so, an ex-sound man, which is why I mentioned the MP3 thing. But that's the main thing I seen in the broadcasting world that I work in for 39 years or so, is just the resistance to NDI, and it's always seen as, don't worry, it's not important.
Yeah.
It's a shame. But eventually, I'm assuming the money will eventually talk. But the interesting thing is the production people that I work with are very interested in using it because it costs less.
Yeah.
But the technical people are still in bed with the big manufacturers, and they want the Sony, and mostly Sony, I suppose. Sorry, Andrew. But it is. It's mostly Sony in our world. But the costs are phenomenal compared to the NDI world. I mean, we now do little football matches. We do hundreds of football matches a year now, which before with a large scanner you would have done 4 or 6 a year. Now we're doing hundreds a year because we can at the low cost. It's eventually it will happen, but it's just taken a long time, a long time.
I think it's important that there are always going to be places where the traditional approaches are the best ones. That is fine. That is totally fine.
Yeah.
And, I think it's really important, and the onus is on us as vendors to understand where those things make sense, understand why they make sense, because they make us stronger, not weaker. And if the places where a Sony switch or a SDI or 2110 is more valuable, we need to understand that. That's good. It makes us stronger to understand that. So I never worry if I learn that it's not being used for something. In fact, I get interested. I want to understand why and how we can maybe help improve that.
Wonderful.
So I embrace that. I think it's diversity is good, and choice for customers is good. And even when it's not always choice of the thing that you did, that's good.
Yeah.
Makes us
excellent.
stronger.
I appreciate Dan and Andrew for your time today. I can tell you that as my wife and I look to build our retirement home in the next couple of years, I am wiring that sucker up to have NDI everywhere. Just even if it's just so I can get my television and my cameras and talk to my parents, we're going to make that happen. But thank you both for joining us today, and I look forward to speaking with you soon. And Dan, if you're going to be at IBC, and Andrew, if you're at IBC, would love to catch up, maybe buy you guys a beer. I'll be there as well.
I will be there, and I'd love to buy you a beer as well.
All right, perfect. All right, well, thank you guys both very much for joining us, and join us next month for another issue of TKT Visionaries.